I understand. Samantha Johnson is on the other side of the courthouse and is standing by with some family members. Let's go over there and see. Sam, what have you been able to learn?
Well, Anne Marie and Emily, just a few moments ago when that verdict was read, the families of the two girls came out right here on the sidewalk underneath the flag. They hugged, they were crying, we saw smiling happen, even obviously a flood of emotions you have to imagine. And like we mentioned earlier, they had been staying in a business just across the street here for days now as this entire community waited for a verdict. I just saw Becky Patty, the grandmother of Libby German, who has been such a spokesperson. She's been at all the hearings for this case. She hugged a family member at that door. She was smiling, she was laughing. Just a moment ago, they walked inside, they gathered their items, and they left, which to me says we've waited, and again, that phrase, today is the day for them. That sign to me showed that, okay, we have waited as long as we could, we've got the verdict, our job here is done. So Anne Marie and Emily, of course, we expect more from families. It's important to note, like we mentioned, that gag order still in place, so they won't talk to you necessarily, but you have to imagine those emotions will continue to come in the days to come. So we'll keep an eye on things here. We'll send it back to you for now.
All right, Samantha, I'll go ahead and take it back for now. We'll get out to Anne Marie, Bob, and Emily, and yourself if you have any other new information that we can share on our ongoing coverage of this verdict that has come in about 20 minutes ago in Delphi, that Richard Allen has been found guilty on all 4 counts, 2 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of murder in the deaths back in 2017 of these 2 young girls. Libby German was just 14 and Abby Williams was just 13. We always want to remind our viewers, this is always about these 2 young girls. It's about their families, the loss that they have suffered for the last 7.5 years. And while there is justice for these families today, there can never be any closure because their girls are never coming back. And our hearts continue to break, and a lot of prayers are being said tonight for these 2 young families, Libby German and Abby Williams. Let's bring our legal analyst back in, Katie Jackson-Lindsay, again joining us. She's a former deputy prosecutor and a current criminal defense attorney. She's been with us every day of this particular trial. So I mentioned the 4 counts that Richard Allen has been found guilty of: felony murder and murder. So total of 4 counts. Tell our viewers again why he was charged for felony murder and murder in the deaths of 2 girls here.
Well, there's a felony murder count per young lady, as well as a knowing and intentional murder count per young lady. So that's why there's 4, despite there only being 2 victims. And so the difference between the 2 is there's knowing and intentional murder. And knowing and intentional murder is just that. Their theory under those charges is that Richard Allen knowingly and intentionally killed these girls without any not having to find any particular reason. Indiana's not a state where they have to prove motive. They just have to prove that it was knowing and intentional. On the other hand, felony murder is where the state's theory is that a person committed some other felony, and during the course of committing that felony, the girls died. So in this case, the state's theory was that even if the jury believed that Richard Allen was only responsible for kidnapping the girls, and the jury believed that that kidnapping resulted in their death, then that's enough to find him guilty of felony murder. So they agreed with each of those theories. They agreed that it was knowing and intentional, and they also agreed with the state that as a result of that kidnapping, Richard Allen was responsible for that kidnapping, and as a result of that kidnapping, each of those girls died.
We heard our crew there in Carroll County tell us that the sentencing date for Richard Allen will take place in 1 month, on December 20th. And we want to kind of get your feeling on whether or not the sentencing will be served consecutively or served concurrently. What is your expectation, and what are the ranges in terms of the sentencing?
So it gets a little bit complicated, but just as a basic understanding, each of the 4 counts carries a penalty range of 45 to 65 years, okay? So that's just understanding the range for each. There's not a difference in the penalty range for murder versus felony murder. And then again, there's 1 set of charges for Abby, and there's 1 set of charges for Libby. So in determining whether to run those counts concurrently or consecutively, the judge has to consider a number of things, a number of factors related to the facts. I think in terms of just the two sets of charges in general, I think we can expect consecutive sentences. If you think about it just purely from a fairness standpoint, these were two separate lives that were lost. These were two separate girls that were died, and they do not deserve to have these sentences to be merged. And I think the judge will likely see it that way. So whether she decides to give the minimum of 45 per young lady or the maximum of 65 per young lady, I think that we'll see that they will be consecutive sentences. Now, where it gets a little bit complicated is that those 4 charges, he can't necessarily be sentenced separately on each of the 4 charges because they would have to merge together so that there's not double jeopardy. So he's not being convicted twice for the same conduct, or not convicted twice, but sentenced twice for the same conduct. So we won't see a scenario where he gets 45 to 65 times 4.
I see.
It would be 45 to 65 times 2 in either case.
All right, we'll get back to Katie and get more legal analysis coming up, but we want to take you back outside the Delphi courthouse and see and talk again with Anne Marie Tiernan and Emily Longnecker.
Scott, I'm also here with Bob Siegel, who was in the courtroom when that verdict was read. We were talking about the family, the defense team. I mean, what were their movements as they were coming in, waiting to determine what was the panel's decision?
Yeah, it was about a half an hour from the time that that the media was invited into the courtroom. Richard Allen was already in the courtroom at the time, so was the entire prosecution team. Andrew Baldwin was there with his hand on the shoulder of Richard Allen, trying to comfort him. The families were there of Abby and Libby. It was not until actually after the judge came back into the courtroom that we saw Richard Allen's family come in, and actually Judge Gall was pretty frustrated. She wanted everybody right there, and she said, all right, we're back on the record. Where is Mr. Rosie? Andrew Baldwin said he's downstairs with the family. She said, let's get him up here right away. And as soon as they came into the courtroom, that's when the jury was asked to come in. And again, it was so fast. Literally, I don't think the jury was actually in the courtroom for more than 3 minutes total. And the judge immediately, as soon as the jury was seated, do you have a verdict?
Count one.
Foreman said yes. All right, we're going to read this. Count 1, guilty. Count 2, guilty. 3, 4, guilty, guilty. Polled all the jurors to make sure that was in fact their verdict. She said, thank you very much. The jury was excused. And again, 3 minutes, it was extremely fast.
And now presumably traveling, getting their items from where they've been sequestered at a hotel and moving back home to Allen County after having nearly a month-long service for this trial.
Yeah, and Emily, you know from being in there almost every day as well, that usually while we're waiting for things to kind of get going, there's a lot of talking and chit-chat in the courtroom. Today,
Not today, but
there was not a single word that was uttered. The families, the attorneys, the reporters, the 30 minutes leading up to, during, and after, it was not until the judge left, but there you could hear a pin drop in that courtroom.
I felt like you could hear a pin drop the day of those closing arguments. When those closing arguments ended and the state had that rebuttal, talking about, think of this, Libby had told her grandmother that one day she wanted to grow up and help police solve crimes, and she did that this time, and she brought her friend Abby to help her. And I remember that afternoon, it was very, very silent. Usually people would leave the courtroom kind of talking, and no one had anything to say that day either. So I thought that was a day as well. But obviously today, I can see where no one would.
Yeah,
just processing everything that had just happened, right?
Very, very solemn. After the verdict was read, the families got to leave first if they wanted to. Immediately, defense attorney Jennifer Auger went over to the Allen family. I saw Kathy Allen's head buried in Miss Auger's shoulder as she was crying and the family was crying. They were trying to comfort the Allen family. And on the other side of the aisle, on the other side of of the courtroom. Obviously, much different emotions. It was a moment, I think, perhaps one of the first moments of celebration that you could see relief and celebration on the faces of Abby and Libby's family. And don't get me wrong here. I mean, it has been hard for these families to find anything to celebrate after this horrific ordeal that started 7.5 years ago. But this was the verdict, this was the day, this was the moment, these were the words they were waiting to hear, and today those words came.